Still Waters, a short story. Young, hurry up. Despite the cold, Young's hands were slick on the rungs as he pulled himself higher and higher. Ever since boot camp, he'd hated climbing the boarding ladder. The first time in basic, he'd made the mistake of looking down. He'd been roughly 200 feet above the water with another 30 or so to go, and had frozen there for a good 90 seconds before the CO's shout pushed him upwards and onto the deck. He'd climbed dozens of boarding ladders in the 18 months since, but the feeling of lightheaded panic still washed over him every time. This particular boarding was more stressful than most, and the only reason he was the first up the ladder was because he'd lost a bet with Huffman. Young was pretty sure Huffman had cheated somehow. He was the kind of fellow who cheated, but he couldn't prove it. So here he was, with his hands clinging to the slippery rungs of the Mariposa, while Huffman sat safe and sound in the warm transmitter room. Not that the Mariposa was responding to any of his radio calls. The Mariposa had been unresponsive for 3 days and had missed her scheduled arrival at port by 1. The Navy had been notified, and the USS Franklin had been the closest to the Mariposa's suspected coordinates, so they had been sent to conduct a welfare check and provide assistance if needed. Even as the tender drew closer to the Mariposa, no passengers or crew appeared at the railing, an unusual lack of response on the open sea. It was a troubling development that settled uncomfortably in his stomach. And that was how Young found himself looking over the silent deck of the Mariposa. Out of habit, he paused at the top of the ladder. "Permission to come aboard?" The only reply was the splash of waves against the hull below. Young pulled himself over the rail, relieved to have his feet on something flat and stable. He leaned over the railing and called to the men in the tender below. "I'm aboard. I don't see anyone. Might be in the cabins. Chilly day. Coming up behind you." Willard, Mayhew, and Clemens were soon standing behind Young, looking every bit as apprehensive as he did. Lyman and Rue stayed behind to mind the tender. "It's a cruiser," Willard said, eyeing the row of empty deck chairs. "Deck ought to be crawling with passengers. It's cold out, but not that cold." "Could be illness," Mayhew said. "Disease can spread fast on a ship. If there's something contagious, the captain could have quarantined everyone to quarters." The other men nodded, relieved. Mayhew's theory made sense. Young felt lingering doubt. The ship held 520 passengers, 85 crew, and not one to be seen, not even one. A primal tingle spread through his body, saying leave, danger, bad things. "We should go to the bridge, find the captain, see what's needed, proceed from there," Clemens said decisively. Clemens was the senior officer and knew best what should be done. The men followed him across the deserted bow into the wheelhouse. The bridge should have been bustling with sailors and crew, 10 men at least, but there was no one. The wheel rocked idly with the movement of the water. The ship was simply drifting. The meters showed the coal furnaces growing cold. Residual heat remained, but certainly not enough heat to produce the steam necessary to propel a vessel forward. How it had stayed more or less on course was a mystery. Even a few hours of drift could push a ship off course enough as to make it impossible to find it in the vastness of the sea. Young felt the nagging discomfort in his stomach tighten into a constant ache. There was a growing undercurrent of dread spreading among the men. Clemens had to keep the situation in hand. He kept his tone sharp to belie his own apprehension. "I suspect Mayhew was right about illness. Still, sick or not," Clemens said briskly, "the captain and his men have egregiously lapsed in their duties. Unprofessional, unacceptable. Trust me when I tell you I'll be personally reporting this. He'll be lucky if he keeps his credentials. Willard, Young, drop anchor. We can't let her keep floating further off course. Mayhew, look through the quartermaster's log, see what you can determine from the record. I'm going to the captain's quarters to give him a piece of my mind." He turned and stalked off, hoping his feigned confidence had rung true. His sailor's instincts told him this was more than a simple quarantine, and he knew the captain's quarters would be empty before he ever raised his fist to the door. He felt a brief hesitation when he placed his hand, shaking now, on the brass knob and twisted. When he saw the room was empty, he exhaled in relief, then was immediately overcome by fresh worry. If not his quarters, then where? Not bothering to knock this time, Clemens entered the chief mate's quarters. These too were empty. The man's gold pocket watch sat unwound atop the dresser. The bed was neatly made. He strode into the bunk room shared by the other bridge mates, also tidy but abandoned. He picked up a leather-bound journal from a bedside table. The owner's name, Nicholas Pemberton, was printed neatly inside the front cover. Clemens hesitated before flipping to the last page, but ultimately decided safety trumped privacy. It was dated March 9, 3 days ago. The entry itself was unremarkable, recording the typical day-to-day life of any sailor, nothing of note. Clemens replaced the journal on the table. He returned to the bridge. "A word, Lieutenant," Mayhew said, his voice low as he placed a hand on Clemens' shoulder. Willard and Young remained occupied with the anchor and took no notice. They stepped just outside onto the deck. "The last recorded entry was dated 4 days ago. After that, there is nothing." Clemens frowned. "Nothing? How can that be?" "There simply isn't anything after mid-morning on March 3rd. All seems in order up until then. Mention of illness? No. Technical difficulties? No." Clemens' tone drew sharper. "Did you read over the last few days with care? It seems you've missed something to me." "I took great care," Mayhew said. "I found no records that would indicate trouble, none." Clemens rubbed the bridge of his nose. One of his headaches was coming on. Mayhew, he knew, was nothing if not diligent. If he said there was nothing of note, there was nothing of note. Nevertheless, it was becoming increasingly apparent that something was amiss. Willard and Young had finished with the anchor. Decisions must be made and directives given. "Willard," Clemens said decisively, "go shout down to the tender to hold their place. Tell them to remain steady for half an hour while we continue to search the ship. Tell them we'll return with them to the Franklin at that time to update Captain Hemming and await further instruction. Then return here." Willard nodded. "Aye, sir." Clemens, Young, and Mayhew fidgeted in uneasy silence as they awaited Willard's return. They could not bear to look at one another, so they gazed out at the blue-black sea. Luckily, Willard was quick. "Message delivered, sir," he said, slightly breathless. "They'll hold for half an hour. We'll go to the cabins, conduct welfare checks. If there's illness, we'll continue to enforce quarantine, radio on for additional medical personnel from the mainland, then proceed with triage care as needed. Understood, men?" "Aye, sir." They began with the first-class cabins that ringed the main deck. Working their way from bow to stern, each man rapped firmly on a door, then, upon obtaining no response, opened it and entered to find it undisturbed. None were locked, which struck Clemens as unusual. The rooms were tidy, with beds crisply made and dresses hanging neatly in armoires. Jeweled hair combs lay beside silver brushes on untouched dressing tables. Handbags were waited beside cabin doors. Handkerchiefs and face compacts and money nestled inside. Clemens was reminded of the Nickelodeons, where the pictures simply stopped moving until another nickel was fed into the machine. It unnerved him, all the fine and expensive things waiting for their owners to add another coin and unpause the frozen picture. He could smell the panic emanating from the other 3 men, his responsibilities, each of them. And he was reminded that it was from him that they would take their cue. His voice and breath and movements would tell them to choose composure or hysteria. "It's certainly odd," he said, hoping his tone inspired ease. "But no need for too much concern as of yet. We'll simply continue on until we've ascertained the situation, and we will provide aid to the best of our abilities." Clemens strode on, but turned when he failed to hear the footfalls of his men behind him. Seeing their faces so serious and pale, he was struck, as he so often was of late, by the childish youth of them. They truly were little more than boys, not one older than 20. He could envision each of them in short pants without a hint of amusement. Once again he was reminded that they looked to him, and his responsibility for their welfare pressed down on his heart like a stone. He turned sharply and frowned with paternal disappointment. Shame would motivate them where the chain of command had failed. "Compliance is not a suggestion. I expect more from trained men like yourselves." 3 sets of eyes dropped to the wooden planks beneath them. He knew they would obey him now, and hoped to God their obedience would not be a regret he relived awake in bed in the middle of the night. They passed into the radio room and could hear the crackle that indicated full working order. Young fought the desperate urge to dart inside and radio the Franklin a terrified mayday. For months he had bemoaned the crowdedness of the ship, but now he longed for the press of his shipmates. He offered up a silent prayer. Lord, if you'll keep me safe this day, I will never again complain about the tight quarters on board. Amen. Young, look sharp, Clemens snapped. We'll search the remaining spaces on this floor, then go back to the tender, return to the ship, and proceed as Captain Hemming directs. His tone softened as he looked into the uncertain eyes of his charges. There's only first-class dining in the ballroom left on main deck, that's all. The first-class dining hall was set for dinner, even though the time was not yet luncheon. Slivered rays of sun cut through the leaded windows and sparkled on the crystal goblets. Young gently picked up a heavy dinner fork, solid silver. He'd never held a utensil so fine and was impressed by the heft of it. A fork like that would glide through a boiled potato without the least bit of effort. It was no wonder the rich seemed so rested. Every task was made simpler by wealth. He replaced the fork carefully, making certain its handle aligned with the knife's just as it had before he touched it. They reached the ballroom and found the doors closed. Unsurprising, given the chilly morning and the cost to heat the massive space. It wouldn't be needed until evening after the dinner service and could be warmed during the meal. Something about the closed doors troubled Young. Clemens' hand was reaching for the brass handles. "Permission to speak, sir." The words burst from Young's mouth with a loudness that made the others jolt. Clemens retracted his hand and crossed his arms over his chest, unsure if he felt exasperated or relieved. "Fine, boy, what is it?" "I think, sir, that we should go back to the Franklin, get more men aboard before we continue the search." Once again, Clemens was struck by the boyishness of his men. His own instincts agreed wholeheartedly with Young's, but he continued to be mindful of the example he set. If he capitulated on an order now, they would be less likely to obey the next one. Aboard a ship like the Franklin, a lapse in the chain of command, even a hesitation in following it, could mean the difference between life and death in the event of combat. He grasped the handle and pulled before he lost his nerve. Clemens noticed the lace of a petticoat first. It was crisp and white, meticulously starched and obviously knitted with great care. It peeked out from beneath a pale blue skirt. Silk or taffeta, he could not be certain. His wife would have known, and he thought of Mary longingly. The bodice above was smocked, and tiny pearl buttons graced the cuffs. The blue of the dress matched the milky blue of the child's eyes, which were fixed unseeingly on the ornate ceiling tiles. A stout man in a brown woolen morning coat lay atop her. 2 middle-aged women in dull day dresses lay atop him. A little boy of 6 or 7 laid stiffly atop them all. 5 stacked dishes in a cupboard. "Get them off of her," Clemens ordered. The men did not move. "She's being crushed," he barked. "They're crushing the girl." "Sir," Young said gently, placing one hand on the lieutenant's arm and gesturing at the room with the other. "She doesn't mind it. None of them mind it." The reality of the situation settled upon him as he looked across the expanse of the enormous room at the rows of stacks before him. He was vaguely aware of the sound of Willard retching onto the green Persian rug and Young shouting to the others to hurry back to the tender to notify Captain Hemming. As if in a dream, Clemens counted, mentally conducting the grim calculations. 121 stacks, 5 bodies each, 605 souls all accounted for. If not for the cloudy, open eyes of many, they could have been sleeping. Clemens looked down at the pile of Willard's vomit, which was edging towards the toe of his shoe. It occurred to him that he should step backwards. He took a single step back, then counted again, checking his math. 121, 605. All of them perfect and blemished, all of them dead.